She thought it was just a joke, a $1 listing for a collapsed cabin in the middle of nowhere. But with a daughter to raise and nowhere else to go, Ellie Harper took a chance. What she found beneath the floorboards was more than just wood and dirt. It was a secret, worth $80 million, and a past no one was supposed to uncover. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if stories about second chances and unexpected twists pull at your heart, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode might just change how you see everything. Ellie Harper stared at the online listing like it had to be a mistake. 1-bedroom cabin, $1. Must be moved into immediately. No refunds. No photos, no address until after payment. Just a GPS pin dropped in the middle of a green smudge labeled Stone Pine National Forest. It sounded like a scam, but for someone like Ellie, scams weren't a deterrent anymore, just part of the noise. Her bank account was gasping, her credit had flatlined, and she'd already sold her late grandmother's china just to make rent that never came. The apartment eviction notice had been final, and her last tank of gas had to take them somewhere. Anywhere. She looked over at her daughter, Lucy, 5 years old, blonde curls tangled, sitting on the floor in her favorite blue dress, still hugging the same worn teddy bear that had survived the past 3 moves. Max, their golden retriever, lay beside her, eyes watching Ellie like he already knew what she was about to do. Ellie clicked. Bye now. It was a split-second decision. There was no plan, no backup, no calls to verify ownership or research property history. Just blind hope. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe she'd just bought a haunted tree stump. But it didn't matter, because something inside her whispered that anywhere was better than nowhere. The confirmation email came 5 minutes later. Attached, GPS, coordinates, and a single line of legal transfer. The property, wherever it was, now belonged to Eleanor Grace Harper, sole owner. She printed the directions at a public library the next morning. The librarian, an older woman with glasses hanging from a beaded chain, glanced at the map and raised an eyebrow. "That's deep country," she said. "You sure you want to take a kid out there?" Ellie didn't answer. What was she supposed to say? That they had no place left? That she'd slept in their car for 2 nights already and Lucy was starting to ask questions she couldn't answer? They packed what little they had, a duffel bag of clothes, a camping stove, a single mattress, and a solar lantern. Ellie strapped her grandfather's old hatchet to the side of her backpack, not for building, but just in case. The drive into the woods took 5 hours. At first, it was all paved roads and gas stations, then gravel, then dirt, then nothing. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter with each passing mile, the signal bars on her phone disappearing one by one. When they reached the end of the trail, it wasn't a clearing or a driveway. It was just trees. Old ones. Tall. Silent. A place forgotten by time. Ellie killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and rot. Lucy held her hand, teddy bear dangling. Max bounded ahead. And then she saw it, the cabin, or what was left of it. The roof sagged. One wall had caved in. Moss clung to the steps. Windows were just black holes. Lucy tugged her sleeve and whispered, "It's falling apart, Mama." Ellie looked at the wreck. She felt the cold bite of failure creep up her spine, but instead of fear, she said the one thing she hadn't felt in months. "Let's see what we can fix." And together, they walked toward the ruins. The first step onto the porch nearly sent Ellie through it. The rotted plank gave way with a loud crack, and she barely caught her balance. Max barked sharply behind her, and Lucy clutched, her stuffed bear tighter, eyes wide. Ellie exhaled and reached down to test the next board, solid, barely. Everything about this place looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. Vines crept up the sides of the cabin like hands trying to pull it back into the forest. The front door hung crooked on one hinge, open just enough to see a sliver of black inside. Ellie pushed it gently, and it scraped across the floor with a groan that echoed too long. Inside, the air was damp and sour. Dust particles floated in the sunlight, slicing through the broken roof like falling stars. The main room was small, a living space and a single back room, both gutted by time and rain. The floor was scattered with debris, broken chairs, torn wallpaper, empty bottles. A small wood-burning stove stood against one wall, rusted shut. Nearby, A pile of firewood had long since rotted into mulch. Lucy took a careful step in, her little boots crunching glass beneath them. "Is this ours?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ellie looked around, forcing herself to see beyond the mess. "Yeah," she said slowly. "It is." Max ran ahead, tail wagging, poking his nose through a pile of leaves that had blown in through the shattered window. He sneezed and barked once, then trotted in a circle like he approved. The back room was no better. A mattress sat on the floor, stained and torn, its springs exposed like the bones of something long dead. Ellie sighed and rolled it outside, then swept the corners for bugs, rodents, or worse. There were none, just old dust and a strange quiet. They spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. Ellie nailed plywood over the broken windows, while Lucy made a game of stacking pine cones in the corner. She boiled water on the camp stove outside and used it to scrub the wood floors with an old rag, working until her hands were raw. By evening, the cabin looked less terrible. The smell was mostly gone. The mattress was replaced by their own, rolled-out sleeping pads. They even strung up the solar lantern from a nail in the beam overhead. It cast a warm, golden light that made the room feel like a campfire. They sat together on the floor, sharing a can of beans and crackers. Ellie wrapped an arm around Lucy, who leaned into her side and whispered, "I think I like it here." Ellie kissed her head, fighting the sting in her eyes. "Me too." That night, long after Lucy fell asleep curled beside Max, Ellie lay awake. The forest outside whispered in the breeze, and the cabin creaked like it remembered how to breathe again. She listened, heart pounding, not from fear but from the quiet flicker of something she hadn't felt in so long. Possibility. The forest was a different kind of alive after dark. Ellie woke just after midnight, unsure what had stirred her. Max lay at her feet, ears perked, eyes open but calm. Beside her, Lucy slept soundly, fingers still curled around the threadbare ear of her teddy bear. The lantern had gone dim, its battery blinking red. Shadows stretched along the walls like tall strangers leaning in. Something creaked outside. Not the wind through the trees, a different sound. Sharp, wooden, as if a foot had pressed against the old porch again. Ellie held her breath. For a moment, she considered reaching for the hatchet she'd wedged behind the door. But Max didn't growl. He simply stood, padded to the window, and stared through the gap between boards. One low huff of breath. No alarm. No panic. Still, Ellie crept over and peered through the same gap. Nothing. Just the moonlight, turning the clearing silver. The broken steps. The trail they'd driven in on. The old well barely visible beyond the tree line. Maybe it was a raccoon. Or her nerves. Either way, sleep wouldn't come again easily. She sat by the fire stove cold and silent, and sipped from a dented thermos of water. Her eyes moved across the interior, settling on the floor. The boards were uneven in places, warped by rain and time. One near the center was bowed slightly, like something beneath it had shifted. She made a mental note to fix it in the morning. Morning, if it ever came. Hours passed slowly. The forest hummed, owls calling in the distance. Ellie finally drifted off sitting upright, her head against the log wall. When she woke, light was breaking through the windows in streaks of gold and green. Max was outside already, barking at birds. Lucy yawned and stretched. "Mama, I had a dream," she said, eyes still half closed. The house was brand new, and there was a man in the floor. Ellie blinked. "A man?" Lucy nodded. He smiled and said he was happy someone came back. Ellie laughed gently, ruffling Lucy's curls. "Sounds like a friendly ghost." She stood and went to check the warped floorboard from the night before. It looked just the same in daylight, uneven but unremarkable. Still, something about it made her pause. She pressed her foot on it. It flexed, just slightly. She'd need tools to lift it. Tools she didn't yet have. But instinct told her to remember that spot, to mark it. They spent the rest of the morning outside, clearing brush and hanging a clothesline. Max roamed nearby, happy as ever. Lucy sang to herself as she played, her voice echoing between the trees. By noon, Ellie stood at the edge of the property, wiping sweat from her forehead. The cabin still looked broken, still forgotten, but now, It also looked like it belonged to someone. It was the sound of Lucy's cry that brought Ellie running. She had only stepped away for a moment, trying to fix the pulley on the old well, when she heard the thud, then Lucy's voice, loud and startled. "Mama?" Ellie dropped the rope in her hands and sprinted back inside, heart hammering, already imagining splinters, blood, worse. Lucy was sitting on the wooden floor in the main room, eyes wide, lip trembling, one arm stretched toward a jagged gap in the planks. The teddy bear was gone. "I dropped him," she whimpered. He slipped through. Ellie knelt and pulled her daughter into her arms. The floorboard beneath Lucy had cracked and split down the center, revealing a dark sliver of space below too narrow to see anything clearly, but deep enough that the bear had vanished without a trace. Max sniffed the edge, ears twitching. "It's okay," Ellie said softly, but her voice caught. "We'll get him back." She moved Lucy to the mattress and gave her a can of juice to calm down. Then Ellie grabbed the crowbar from her pack, one of the only real tools she'd brought, and wedged it between the cracked boards. The wood groaned, reluctant, but after a few hard pulls, it gave way with a dry pop, revealing a small crawl space beneath the floor, about 2 feet deep, lined with old concrete and timber. She expected to see dirt or nesting animals. Instead, she saw metal. Ellie blinked. In the shadows, half covered by rotted insulation, was the edge of something smooth, flat, gray. She reached down, pushed aside the debris, and found herself staring at a rusted steel hatch embedded in the foundation. No markings, no handle, just a sealed square, framed in riveted bolts, like a door that hadn't been opened in decades. Her breath caught. This wasn't part of a normal cabin. She shone her lantern down into the space and spotted Lucy's bear lodged in the corner, untouched. Ellie reached in, carefully pulled it out, and handed it back to her daughter with a kiss on the head. "He's okay," she said, but her eyes were already drifting back to the hatch. That night, after Lucy had fallen asleep again, Ellie returned to the crawl space with a flashlight and gloves. The hatch was heavier than it looked, and without a visible lock, it seemed impossible to open. She traced the edges, found faint seams in the concrete around it, and noticed something else, a faint hum, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of electricity buried far below. Ellie sat back on her heels. What was this place? The cabin was supposed to be abandoned. Worthless. Nothing more than a crumbling structure sold for pocket change. But now, buried beneath rotting floorboards and a child's lost toy, it held a question, one she wasn't sure she was ready to answer, and one she knew she couldn't ignore. Ellie couldn't sleep, not after finding that hatch. She lay beside Lucy, listening to her daughter's soft breathing, but her mind kept circling back to the crawl space, to the hum beneath the floor, the strange sealed door, the way it didn't belong in a cabin that barely stood upright, the kind of thing someone built not to be found, or not to be opened. By dawn, the decision was made. She couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. After breakfast, she gave Lucy a stack of coloring pages and set her up on a blanket outside with Max watching over her. Then Ellie grabbed her crowbar, a hammer, and a hand trowel, and headed back into the house. The crawl space was tight, awkward. Dust filled her throat as she pried up more boards to give herself space. With the lantern propped on a paint can, she scraped around the hatch's edge with the crowbar, testing for any weak points. Hours passed. The sun rose high. Sweat soaked her back. She stopped only when Lucy called for lunch, then went right back to it, driven by something deeper than curiosity, something like need. Finally, her fingers found it, a hairline seam in the concrete just outside the hatch, and within it, something metal, a latch. Not a keyhole, more like a lever, hidden beneath a false plank. Ellie dug around it until she could hook her crowbar under and pull. There was a soft click. The hum grew louder, almost imperceptibly. She stepped back, heart pounding. The hatch released with a soft hiss, as if it had been vacuum sealed. Cold air spilled out, damp and stale. Ellie's breath caught as she pulled the door fully open. A narrow metal staircase descended into darkness. She stared for a long time, flashlight beams swallowed by the pitch below. She thought about stopping, about sealing it back up, but something, instinct, fate, desperation, kept her feet moving. Each step groaned under her weight. The air smelled of earth and time, The walls were lined with concrete and riveted steel. This wasn't a storm shelter or a root cellar. It was industrial, purposeful. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low, square room. The walls were smooth and clean beneath a thin layer of dust. No cobwebs, no debris, just silence. And at the far end of the room, a vault door. Not a safe, not a box. A vault. 6 feet tall, circular, with faded red stenciling barely visible across the top. Property of EDH. Beneath it, a smaller steel safe sat atop a concrete slab. And above that, scratched faintly into a wooden rafter, a number. 21,394. Ellie stared. Nothing about this made sense. She stepped forward, trembling, and spun the combination into the smaller safe. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. Inside were 2 things. A thick stack of paper-wrapped bills, yellowed by age, and a leather-bound ledger. She didn't touch either, not yet. Because in that moment, one thing was terrifyingly, undeniably clear. This cabin hadn't been abandoned. It had been buried and forgotten on purpose. Ellie sat on the floor of the hidden room for what felt like hours, too stunned to move. The weight of the air around her had changed thick with silence and history. This wasn't just some survivalist's hideout or forgotten storm shelter. No, someone had built this space to protect something, or to hide it. She finally reached into the safe. The bills were brittle to the touch, stacked in neat bundles wrapped with faded banking tape. The ink was smudged, but the denomination was clear. $100. She counted quickly, 50 bundles. Her breath caught. She wasn't a math genius, but she knew what she was holding. $500,000. And that was just the small safe. The ledger beneath the cash was even stranger. Thick pages of handwritten entries in perfect cursive. Figures, names, locations, shipping manifests. Some pages were marked with symbols, a triangle, a circle, a star. Others had stamps beside them, red, governmental, almost military. Ellie's skin prickled. She flipped to the back and found something even more chilling, a list of names. One of them, Elijah D. Harper, her last name. She stood and walked to the vault at the back wall. Unlike the smaller safe, it had no obvious lock, no keypad, just a heavy wheel in the center, frozen with age and rust. She grasped it and tried to turn. Nothing. It might as well have been welded shut. But what stopped her wasn't the resistance. It was the writing on the wall beside it, barely visible under the dust, scratched in with something sharp. If found, tell no one. Not until you know what's here. Her pulse spiked. Someone had warned future finders. Someone who expected this place to be uncovered, someday. Someone like Elijah? She returned upstairs with the ledger tucked tightly under her jacket. Lucy was napping in the sun, Max curled up beside her. Everything looked normal, trees swaying, birds chirping like she hadn't just walked out of a hidden bunker beneath their feet. She sat on the cabin's steps and stared out at the woods, the weight of what she'd found slowly pressing into her chest. What was this place? Who was Elijah Harper? And why had she ended up here? That night, after Lucy was asleep again, Ellie carefully unwrapped a few bundles of the cash. Each bill was real old but traceable, stamped with issue dates from the late 1932 and early 42. Some carried red seals, war bonds. She realized then, this wasn't just money, it was history. Money that likely hadn't moved in decades. Which meant if it was still here, no one had come looking. No banks, no relatives, no authorities. No one even knew this vault existed. And now she did. By morning, Ellie had barely slept. The ledger lay on the cabin table, lit by the pale glow of the solar lantern. She'd spent most of the night flipping through it, page by page, trying to piece together a story that refused to reveal itself all at once. The handwriting was elegant, careful, the kind used by someone raised when penmanship mattered. Most pages were dated between 1933 and 1949. Each was a record of transactions, deposits, withdrawals, shipments. But none of them mentioned banks or businesses. Instead, they referenced initials, E, D, H, repeatedly. That much was obvious, Elijah David Harper. But other initials kept appearing too. M, W, H, S, T, R. Pages marked with dollar amounts and strange locations. Depot 3, Site B, Cellar 7. No context, no explanation. Toward the center of the ledger, a single page was circled in thick red pencil. The date, the 12th of July, 1949. The entry read, "Transfer complete. Final site secured beneath cabin. No further movement unless compromised. Confirmed. $79.8 million total. Final." Ellie's mouth went dry. It wasn't just some emergency stash of war-era cash. It was a fortune, buried, hidden, and sealed beneath a $1 cabin in the middle of nowhere. But why? She flipped to the very last page. There, in different ink, darker, shakier, someone had scribbled a message. "If you're reading this, I am gone. Protect it. They will come. Trust no one. You carry our name that means something. E. D. H." She sat back, her hands trembling. The warning rang in her ears louder than the morning wind. You carry our name. She had never known any Elijah Harper. Her father's family had scattered before she was born. Her mother barely spoke of them. But maybe this wasn't coincidence. Maybe the land, the cabin, the listing had found her. She needed answers. Real ones. She snapped photos of the ledger pages and tucked the book under her jacket again. Then she loaded Lucy and Max into the truck and drove back toward town 40 miles down a winding, dusty road that still hadn't been paved since the Eisenhower era. At the county clerk's office, a clerk named Janine peered over the counter at Ellie with mild suspicion. "Elijah Harper?" she repeated, pulling open a database on her ancient computer. "Haven't heard that name in a long time." She typed slowly, then stopped. "Looks like he owned about 40 acres of land outside Stone Pine. Transferred to a holding company in 1949. Then nothing. Property sat dormant for decades, eventually defaulted. Nobody claimed it." She squinted. "You say you bought that cabin?" Ellie nodded. "Well, technically, the cabin was part of that original Harper tract." Janine shrugged. "Could be coincidence. Or maybe you've got a legacy you don't know about." Legacy. The word hit her like thunder. She thanked Janine and walked out, blinking in the sun. Something was happening, something larger than her. A door had opened, and Ellie was standing right in the middle of it. The library in Stone Pine was barely more than a converted trailer. One room, 2 dusty computers, and a single elderly librarian who introduced herself simply as Marge. Ellie explained. She was researching a relative, Elijah David Harper, and Marge's eyebrows lifted like she'd heard a ghost's name. "Harper," she repeated, slowly. "You mean the old prospector?" Ellie leaned in. "Prospector?" Marge nodded and shuffled to a back shelf where yellowing newspaper archives sat in brittle plastic sleeves. "Rumor was, Elijah Harper struck a rich vein of gold up in those hills around 1937, she said. "Real hush-hush about it. Never filed a mining claim. Just disappeared for months. Came back with a fancy coat and a busted wagon axle." Ellie stared, stunned. "So the gold, it was real?" Marge shrugged. "Depends who you ask. Town council tried to buy his land out more than once. Railroad company too. He always said no. Then one day in 49, poof, gone. Folks said he skipped town. Others," she lowered her voice, "others think he never left. Just buried himself in that forest same as he buried the gold." Ellie sat down, notebook open. "Did he have family?" "Not that anyone knew," Marge said. "No wife, no kids on record. Only a sister, maybe, who moved east." "Why?" Ellie hesitated, then said it out loud for the first time. "I think I might be related to him." Marge blinked at her, eyes narrowing with sudden interest. Back at the cabin, Ellie stood outside the back wall and stared at the crooked fireplace. It jutted from the structure at an odd angle, one she hadn't thought much about until now. Something Marge said kept echoing in her ears. He never left. Ellie stepped inside and ran her hands along the hearth. The stones were rough, uneven. Her fingers caught on a small crack where 2 stones met. A breeze. Her breath caught. She grabbed her hatchet and began prying carefully, bit by bit, stone by stone. Then, behind a loosened brick, a hollow. She reached in. A set of old mining tools lay inside a rusted chisel, a handheld pickaxe, and a leather pouch still heavy with dust and grit. Ellie poured it onto the floor and gasped. Gold flakes. Real ones. Tiny, jagged, unmistakably gold. The wall had hidden a stash of tools used to access something deeper. She ran outside and circled the cabin's rear. Overgrown brush concealed a small, sloped section of ground, disturbed in a perfect line. Ellie dropped to her knees, clawing through the weeds, and there it was. A narrow wooden hatch, half-rotted, concealed beneath ivy and dirt. She pulled it open. A tunnel, just tall enough to crawl through. The air rushing out smelled of stone, sulfur, and time. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She had just discovered the entrance to a mine untouched for nearly a century. And now, for the first time, she believed it. She wasn't just fixing up a broken-down cabin. She had stumbled into a legacy buried beneath her very name. Ellie stared down into the tunnel, the breath catching in her throat. It was just wide enough to crawl through on her hands and knees. Roots hung from the ceiling like old fingers, and the dirt beneath her palms was damp and cool. Max stood nearby, tail stiff, ears twitching. Even he seemed to sense it. This wasn't just another forgotten corner of the woods. This was something else. She shone her flashlight into the tunnel. The beam disappeared into blackness. "Stay with Lucy," she whispered to Max, patting his head. She had left her daughter napping under the porch with a blanket and a half-read book. Max would guard her. He always did. Ellie dropped to her knees and entered the tunnel. The earth swallowed her in silence. For the first 20 feet, it was nothing but dirt walls and thick air. Then, suddenly, the tunnel opened. A hand-chiseled stone chamber unfolded before her low ceiling, roughly 6 feet across. And in the center, a wooden support beam, carved with the initials E.D.H. Her great-uncle, or whoever he had been, had built this with his own hands. She panned her flashlight across the space. Metal rails, broken and rusted, led from the far wall into darkness. Mining tracks. A rotted cart lay toppled on its side, its contents long spilled and forgotten. But against the far corner, sealed in wax paper and canvas, something caught her eye. She stepped forward and peeled the canvas back. Gold, rough, unrefined, and gleaming in the flashlight's beam. She sucked in a breath, knees trembling. Not just flakes or dust nuggets, real ones, heavy, earthborn. And next to them, a locked wooden box with a brand on top, the same triangle symbol she'd seen in the ledger. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She turned to leave but stopped when the beam of her flashlight flickered and landed on the wall to her right, where someone had scrawled a message in chalk, nearly worn away. "I couldn't take it with me." Ellie froze. It wasn't fear she felt, not exactly. It was awe, like standing in the center of a story that had been paused for 70 years and had just resumed. She backed out of the tunnel carefully, cradling the box, brushing dust from her jeans. Outside, the sun had begun to dip through the trees. Max was still there, sitting beside Lucy, who looked up and smiled sleepily. "Where'd you go, Mama?" Ellie knelt beside her and hugged her tight. "I found something, baby," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "Something big." She didn't say the word yet. Gold. Not out loud. Not until she was sure. But in her hands, she held proof of a fortune buried beneath their feet. Not stolen. Not cursed. Just forgotten. And now, for the first time, she realized someone might want it back. The first sign was the footprints. Ellie found them the next morning, just past the edge of the clearing. Heavy, deliberate, sunk deep into the wet soil, too large to be Lucy's, and far too fresh to be old. Max sniffed at them, fur bristling along his back, a low growl rumbling from his chest. She followed them 20 feet into the trees before they disappeared completely, as if whoever made them had known exactly where to walk to cover their trail. Ellie froze. They weren't alone. She hurried back to the cabin and locked the door, as if that could stop whatever might come. Lucy was inside coloring, oblivious. Ellie didn't tell her anything, just made her hot chocolate, kissed her forehead, and sat in the doorway with the crowbar across her lap, watching the woods. She stayed like that all afternoon, eyes flicking to every shadow. Every rustle felt like a threat. Every breeze felt too intentional. The forest, once peaceful, now pressed in on her like a secret trying to whisper. When night fell, Ellie didn't sleep. She stayed up with Max, lantern dimmed to low, crowbar still in reach. Hours passed. The woods seemed to hold its breath. Then just past midnight a sound. A soft knock. Not on the door. On the wall. 3 slow taps, knuckles against wood. Max barked and lunged. Ellie sprang to her feet, grabbed the lantern and crowbar, heart racing, pulse hammering in her ears. She stepped outside into the darkness. "Who's there?" she called. No answer. She swept the beam of her flashlight along the edge of the trees. Just forest, just stillness. Then a movement. A shadow, stepping out from behind an oak. An old man, thin, wiry. Wore a canvas jacket and boots caked in mud, a cap pulled low over silver hair. His hands were raised empty, calm. "I don't want trouble," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, but not threatening. "I just want to know if it's been opened." Ellie didn't move. "What?" "The vault," he said. "The one Elijah built." Her mouth went dry. "Who are you?" she asked. He took a slow step forward, still hands up. "Name's Clyde. I worked with Elijah. Long time ago." Before he vanished. Max stopped barking but stayed pressed against Ellie's leg. Clyde nodded toward the cabin. He always said someone would come back. Never said who. Just someone who'd know what to do. Ellie stared. She didn't know what to believe, or if she even could. Clyde looked down at the ground, then back up. "I buried it with him, helped him hide the whole thing. But I never knew who he left it for. Until now." Ellie lowered the crowbar a little, her grip still tight. "Why now?" she asked. The old man gave a sad smile. "Because someone else is looking too." Clyde didn't ask to come inside. He stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes heavy with time. There was something in the way he looked at the cabin, not fear, not nostalgia, but something closer to guilt. Ellie stepped out, Max trailing close behind. "You said you worked with Elijah?" she asked. Clyde nodded. "In 47, I was just a kid, but I helped him dig the lower shaft. He was smart, too smart for this town. Knew where the gold was, knew how to hide it, and he didn't trust anyone." His eyes flicked toward the trees. For good reason. He reached into his coat slowly and Ellie tensed, but all he pulled out was a folded piece of paper. A map, old and torn, the kind that had survived more winters than it should have. He handed it to her. "I drew this. The day we sealed the main chamber," Elijah said. "We bury it, and we bury the truth with it." Ellie unfolded it. The drawing was crude, but it showed the cabin, the hatch under the floor, and the shaft behind the fireplace. It even marked a second tunnel she hadn't found yet. "I thought he died," Clyde continued, his voice softer now. "One day he just stopped coming. No goodbye, no body, no noise, just gone." Ellie looked up. "He was my great-uncle. I only found out when I saw the ledger." Clyde let out a dry laugh. "Ledger's still here?" "Well, damn." Figured the others took it. "What others?" His expression shifted. "Railroad men, big money types. Wanted his land. Elijah wouldn't sell. Said they were trying to run him off, steal what he'd built. One night, someone shot at his cabin. After that, he vanished." Ellie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Did you think he was murdered?" "I don't know," Clyde admitted. "All I know is, we buried a treasure, and the town buried the man." They stood in silence for a long moment. The woods rustled softly, wind weaving through pine needles like whispered warnings. Ellie gestured to the door. "You want to see it?" Clyde hesitated, then shook his head. "I've carried that vault in my bones for 50 years. I don't need to open it to remember what's in there." He looked at her hard. "But I had to see who found it. Make sure it was someone who understood what it meant." She swallowed. "And, do I?" Clyde smiled, tired and kind. "You stayed. That's more than most would have done. That tells me enough." He turned to leave, his footsteps silent on the forest floor. Just before he disappeared into the trees, he paused. "One more thing," he called over his shoulder. "If you think the gold's the only thing worth protecting down there, you're not done reading." And then he was gone. Ellie stood alone again on the porch, map in hand, heart racing. What else had Elijah buried? Ellie stared at the old map long after Clyde had vanished into the trees. The paper trembled in her hands, not from the wind but from the weight of what it meant. Elijah hadn't just buried gold. He had buried a story, one the town had chosen to forget, or worse, erase. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she flipped through the ledger again, page by page, searching for context. Somewhere near the middle, she found a series of entries all marked with the same strange abbreviation, RRT8. Each line had a dollar amount beside it. Then came the word, bribe. Her blood ran cold. The following morning, Ellie left Lucy with Max and drove the truck back into town. She didn't go to the library or the county office this time. She went to the local paper, the Stone Pine Chronicle, a weekly publication that ran on coffee fumes and town gossip. The editor, a wiry man named Reed Porter, looked up from his desk with mild suspicion when she walked in, holding a yellowed ledger and a folder of documents. "I need to ask about Elijah Harper," she said, placing the ledger down in front of him. "And what happened in 1949? Reed blinked. "That's a name I haven't heard in decades. Why?" Ellie opened the folder and pulled out a few pages. Ledgers, land deeds, the bribe entries. Reed's eyes widened. "You found this?" he asked quietly. "Where?" "On the land I own." "His land," Ellie said. "And I think people tried to steal it." Reed looked down again, then leaned back in his chair with a long sigh. "You're not wrong. My grandfather worked at this paper when it was typewritten. Said Elijah Harper turned down an offer from a railroad company in 48 big money to run tracks through his land. He refused. Said it would destroy the forest, poison the streams." Reed flipped through the documents. Weeks later, there were fires, a break-in at his cabin. Then he vanished. Nobody asked too many questions. The railroad went another direction, and folks pretended it had all been a misunderstanding. Ellie leaned in. "He didn't just vanish, he was forced out." Reed looked up. "Or buried alive." They sat in silence for a moment. "Would you print it?" Ellie asked. "His story?" Reed nodded slowly. "It's time someone did." Later that day, Ellie returned to the cabin and sat on the front steps with the ledger in her lap. Lucy played with Max in the clearing, chasing butterflies. Everything looked normal, but Ellie knew better now. These woods had secrets, and so did the people who once tried to steal them. And someone, maybe more than one, might still want to. Inside, she locked the ledger in the safe, double-checked the trapdoor, and made a quiet promise to Elijah Harper. "I'll finish what you started." But that night, as shadows fell across the trees once again, Ellie found a note pinned to the cabin door. One sentence, typed. "Sell the land, or disappear." Ellie read the note 3 times, each word colder than the last. Sell the land, or disappear. No signature, no trace. Just a scrap of paper, pinned to her front door with a small nail, driven straight into the wood like it had been done in a hurry but by someone who didn't care if she found it. Max growled low, ears rigid as Ellie pulled the note down. Lucy was still asleep, thank God. Ellie folded the paper and slid it into her jacket pocket, heart pounding. She scanned the trees. Nothing moved. But something was there. She could feel it the way animals sense a coming storm before it's visible. By noon, she had reinforced every window, covered the hatch under the floor, relocked the safe. She even hid the ledger in a hollowed-out cabinet beneath the stove, just in case. But fear wasn't the only thing stirring in her now. There was anger, too. A raw, rising defiance. This land had been taken once or nearly. And now that it was hers, someone wanted it again. Not for the cabin, not for the forest, for the vault, the mine, the legacy. The next day, she drove back into town and met with the only lawyer who didn't advertise on plastic grocery bags. Miles Ashford, mid-52nds, former prosecutor, and one of the few people left who had lived through the Harper disappearance. "You're saying someone threatened you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as she slid the note across his desk. "I'm saying someone wants what I found, and they're not going to stop." Ellie laid out everything. The cabin, the documents, the vault, the gold. Even Clyde. Miles listened in silence, eyes narrowing, hands folded on the desk. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said slowly, "if Elijah Harper never legally passed the property to an heir, then under dormant estate law, your ownership through purchase could be challenged. But," he held up a finger, "if you can prove direct lineage, and that the assets were knowingly transferred to you even symbolically, then no one else can touch them." Ellie reached into her bag and handed him the ledger. "This is proof," she said. "He left it behind for someone with our name." Miles flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. "This ledger, combined with possession, your name, and the condition of the property, it builds a hell of a griot case." He looked up. "But it also makes you a target." "I already am." He tapped his fingers on the desk. "Then I'll file a claim with the Historical Land Registry, request an injunction against any future buyers, and put your name on every record I can find. If they want to challenge this, they'll have to do it in court." Ellie felt the breath she'd been holding finally escape. "Thank you. But be careful," Miles said. "If this gold is real, you're sitting on 80 million reasons for someone to make you disappear." Back at the cabin that evening, Ellie found the hatch's dust layer disturbed. Someone had tried to open it. Ellie stood in the cabin's center, staring down at the floorboards covering the hatch. The dust had been wiped clean, in a perfect semicircle, not with a boot, but with a gloved hand. Someone had been in the cabin. Someone had tried to lift the hatch. She checked the locks, all intact, windows sealed, no sign of forced entry. Which meant one thing. They had a key. She moved fast. First, she relocated the gold stash and ledger to a hidden compartment in the mine shaft behind a rotted support beam that had collapsed just enough to leave a hollow. Then she set up a string of makeshift trip alarms around the property, using empty soda cans and fishing line. Not much, but enough to give her seconds of warning if someone got too close. And then she did something that took every bit of pride she had left. She asked for help. She called Clyde. He answered on the third ring. "They came," she said. "I figured they might." He was there before sundown. Not alone this time. He brought two others, old-timers like himself. Quiet, weathered, the kind of men who didn't flinch at the word vault. Ellie didn't ask names. She just handed them flashlights and nodded toward the cabin. "Watch the woods. Watch the hatch. I'll handle the rest." The next morning, Ellie and Lucy drove to the state capitol. With Miles Ashford's help, she walked into the Historical Land Claims office with a stack of evidence. The ledger, the deeds, the bribe documents, photos of the mine, and Clyde's hand-drawn map. 3 hours later, the paperwork was filed. 2 days after that, the Department of Historical Preservation sent confirmation. The land, and all historical assets on it, were now protected under state law. No buyer, corporation, or entity could claim ownership without direct Harper lineage or consent from the registered owner, Eleanor Grace Harper. It was official. The land, the vault, the story was hers. On the way home, Lucy sat in the back seat humming softly, hugging her teddy bear. Ellie glanced at her in the rearview mirror and smiled. "You okay back there?" Lucy grinned. "Yeah, I like the forest." Ellie's chest tightened with quiet joy. When they returned, Clyde and his quiet watchman had cleaned up the property, cleared brush, patched a wall, even rebuilt part of the porch. No one said much. They just worked. Ellie stepped onto the porch, ran her fingers across the wood, and turned toward the woods. The wind rustled the trees like applause. This land had been stolen, buried, forgotten. Now it was reclaimed. And she had done it not with money or power but with grit, truth, and the name written in her blood. The letter arrived by courier, no return address, hand-delivered, sealed in a crisp black envelope. Ellie opened it on the front porch, fingers smudged with soil from a morning spent rebuilding a fence. Inside was a single page printed on thick cardstock. At the top, Carrington Heritage Holdings, LLC, a name she'd seen once before in the bribe entries in Elijah's ledger. The message was brief. "Miss Harper, we are aware of the assets recently uncovered on your property and recognize their historical and monetary value. We are prepared to offer you a full settlement of $80 million USD for ownership of the land, the vault, contents, and all associated mineral rights. This offer is valid for 24 hours. After that, We will pursue alternative avenues of acquisition. CHH Legal Division. Ellie sat in silence, heart thudding. $80 million. $80 million. More than she could have imagined. Enough to buy safety, a new life, a future for Lucy where money never dictated the terms of their survival. She read the letter again. The words alternative avenues of acquisition stood out like a threat. She wasn't naive. This wasn't just business. It was pressure legal muscle wrapped in polished language. They had known she'd filed the land claim, and now they were testing her will. Clyde read the letter and said nothing at first, just stared off into the trees. Then, Elijah said someone would try this. He knew they wouldn't stop with threats. If they couldn't scare us, they'd try to buy us. Cheap, for them. Ellie laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. 80 million doesn't feel cheap. Clyde turned to her. Depends on what it costs you. That night, she sat on the cabin floor with Lucy asleep beside her, watching the lantern's light flicker across the ceiling. The ledger rested on her lap. She flipped to Elijah's final entry again, fingers tracing his words. You carry our name that means something. And then, folded in the back of the ledger, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A letter addressed to my future blood. She opened it slowly. Inside. If you've made it this far, you've already earned what I couldn't protect. The land doesn't belong to anyone with money. It belongs to the ones who bled into it, believed in it, and chose not to sell it when it got hard. If you take their offer, I'll never blame you. But if you don't, if you keep it, then build something that lasts. Make it mean something. Make it more than gold. Tears blurred her eyes. She folded the letter and held it close to her chest. The next morning, Ellie called the number on the card. A man answered. I'm declining, she said simply. There was silence on the other end. Then, a clipped reply. You're making a mistake. Ellie smiled as she looked out across the sunlit clearing, her daughter chasing Max through tall grass, laughter ringing like a bell. No, she said softly. I'm making something that matters. And hung up. Summer came fast that year. The trees surrounding the cabin turned a deeper green, the kind that only happens when something broken finally starts to heal. The porch had been fully rebuilt, the roof no longer sagged, and Ellie had painted the front door a deep forest blue, her father's favorite color. Small things, maybe. But to her, they were sacred. Inside, the vault remained sealed, not because she couldn't open it, but because she didn't need to yet. The real treasure wasn't what was locked in steel. It was what had come from it. She used a portion of the gold to establish a private land trust, protecting the entire Harper tract from ever being sold, mined, or developed. The rest remained untouched. The mine stayed hidden. The cabin, however, was transformed. She called it Harper Haven. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a legacy site, a place for women starting over. Survivors, single mothers, veterans, anyone who'd been told they had nothing left. Ellie hosted weekend retreats, skills workshops, quiet fireside evenings under the stars. No one asked for much, just a place to begin again. The first woman who arrived was named Tasha, 32. Divorced, scared. She hadn't touched a wrench in her life but spent 3 hours helping Ellie dig a new garden bed. By the end of the weekend, she was laughing, sleeping through the night, planning her next move. Then came Mia, then Janelle, then 4 more. Word spread. People came not because of the vault but because of the story. The girl who found $80 million and said no. The woman who turned a broken cabin into something holy. One afternoon, Ellie sat on the porch sipping iced tea while Lucy read aloud from a book about strong women in history. Max lay in the shade beside them, gray around the muzzle now but still her guardian. Clyde stopped by once a week. Sometimes he brought honey from his bees, sometimes just stories, but he always lingered by the edge of the forest before leaving, as if Elijah might step out from the shadows and finally see what had become of his buried dream. Ellie had framed his final letter. It hung just inside the door, beside a photo of the cabin on the day she bought it, leaning, rotting, lost. Visitors often stared at it and asked why she never sold. She always gave the same answer, quiet and honest. Because some things aren't meant to be traded, they're meant to be rebuilt. And every night, when the sun sank behind the trees and the porch lights clicked on one by one, Ellie Harper would walk through the cabin, locking the doors not out of fear but with gratitude. This place had saved her, had given Lucy roots, had reminded her that even the most broken things, families, homes, hearts, could be restored if someone believed they were worth the work. And she did. She always would.